so close to heaven.
Salisbury. Population 39,320. Pubs 51. Churches 20. Weekly markets 2. Masterpieces 1. I was born in Salisbury. Till I was 15, I lived in this tiny cottage. The vast cathedral informs my earliest memories.
Salisbury Spire is the highest in England. Narrow streets nearby lead through ancient gateways to the main part of the city.
Well, my heartbeat is running wild because of you, my problem child. Oh, baby.
In the 1950s, I went to school in the walled close that surrounds the cathedral. First of all, here, where I threw up half a pound of butter that I drunk for breakfast. Happy days. I was literally in the shadow of the spire. Then I went here, to the cathedral school in the former Bishop's Palace. To have spent so many years in this place was a singular privilege. It was to be subjected to a diet of architectural perfection. Vergers, a platoon of godly minders who are not ordained, open the cathedral at 6:30 every morning.
Nobody here. Real privilege being the first person through the door. Just beginning to bring the place back to life. It's been asleep overnight, if you like. And so we're waking the giant. It's a very friendly giant, but bit by bit, bits start to stir, things start to come alive. As each part of the cathedral opens, so we're preparing for individuals' needs, and this is the door the choristers will come through in the morning for their morning choir practice.
I may not have learnt to be a Christian gentleman. I may not have learnt piety. I may not have learnt to appreciate sacred dirges. But I did develop a preoccupation, going on an obsession with buildings, despite what they were used for, despite what they represented. What they represented was the desiccation and snobbery of the clergy. In those days, clerics tended to be believers.
It is more than just a place to work, it's a way of life. For a whole army of people, this is a place of... a really special place that gives them more than just a sense of satisfaction in a job that they do. It gives them a real sense of awe and wonder. It's not quite like going to work in a shop in the high street. So we go from medieval splendour and Victorian keys to 21st century technology and our modern touchscreen digital computer system that operates our sound system.
The spire was at once everyday and wonderful. I both took it for granted and marvelled at it. Familiarity in this instance bred delight, hallucinatory clarity, vertiginous delirium. When, no longer a child, I encountered Gustave Flaubert's dictum, it might equally have been Andy Warhol's, that if you stare at anything long enough, it becomes fantastical.
There she goes again.
I thought of the spire, merely because I had stared at it so long. However, I had stared at it because it is fantastical, not to make it so, not to transform it. It transformed me just as it was meant to. The spire is astonishing, but then astonishment was its purpose. For almost 700 years, it was the tallest man-made structure in these islands.
Well, old tall Sally sheet, built speech, got everything at home, 'cause your needs always. Hey, baby, ooh, baby, having me some fun tonight.
On and off, I've been working on the spire for about 30 years. I started on the cathedral in 1969. It's a beautiful place, there's no doubt about that. It's improved now to when I first came out. It used to be a dirty place, it was full of pigeons. Now it's all clean, everything's out. Here you're about 250 foot up, okay? And we've got another 187, I think it is, to go on from here to the weather door. Then we go outside the weather door, which is probably another 40 foot. Okay, you all ready? We're at the dodgy part of the job now. Rigging this up. Once this is rigged up, everyone should be safe. How old are you?
50.
And I'm 62, and you make me doing all the running about. Well, on the top of the spire, up by the cross there, people say they can feel movement, but I've never felt movement up there when I've been up there. People got this imagination that everything is different down below. It's not, you're just smaller.
All right. I can't help myself out because them bloody chains dropped down underneath me belt with this bloody badger thing on it. Never mind. It's all right, I ain't got enough further. I've got to move around and let you on a bit.
We're changing the warning lamps, the aircraft warning lights, to keep the aircraft away from the top of the spire. And there was a story that during the war, the Germans never bombed it because it was a beacon. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. It is a big chimney. Or an upside-down megaphone. One doesn't know whether the people inside are speaking to God or God is speaking through them, but a megaphone.
The spire is beacon, sacred sign, inspiration, which word contains within it the word spire. That, however, is a happy coincidence. The two do not share a common root.
Ow!
Unlucky man. That could be a fatal incision. Salisbury is greater than anywhere else in Europe.
Just for old time's sake.
This is where British archaeology was born in the 17th century. Out of scholarly curiosity about the past, a taste for the past is not elemental, it has to be learnt. As a child growing up in the middle of all this ancientness, I was persistently enjoined to awe, to humility, to pride in the precious patrimony on my doorstep. And I have to say that for a long time I failed. I just didn't get it. Then, when I was 8, a gardener grazed himself on a rose thorn. He contracted tetanus. He died, lockjaw. The inquest fascinated me. The rose was adjudged to have been a vector of tetanus because of the bodies buried beneath the garden where it grew. The very earth was contaminated by the chemical ghosts of millennia. The past was present. The dead were with us still and adding to their number, recruiting with their long decomposition. I began to get it. But I still didn't get Stonehenge, which is only 11 miles from Salisbury. Still haven't. It's in the wrong place. Why is it situated in a declivity? It ought surely to be on the horizon.
So close to
The successive cultures which inhabited Wiltshire had used and reused the same upland sites. And they used and reused the same stones. Progress would only be hampered by preserving former cultures' artefacts. Our ancestors looked forward. Old Sarum is an earthwork to the immediate north of what is today Salisbury. It was an Iron Age fortress, a Roman encampment, a Norman garrison. Salisbury's first cathedral, St Osmond's, was built here in 1078, and here church and army lived side by side.
Yes, 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 yes.
One God now and forever.
The church and the army. To this day, the defining trades of this corner of England. They have much in common. The obligations of fidelity, duty, service. The preoccupations with rank, kit, ceremonial. But relationships between the two at Old Sarum were far from cordial, and the garrison, which enjoyed the Crown's patronage, got the upper hand. In the early 13th century, the church took the decision to turn the other cheek, to move to the valley.
Once upon a time, the bishop at Old Sarum decided to move his cathedral to a new place. So a soldier stood on the ramparts of the castle and shot an arrow. It hit a deer, and where the deer finally fell was the place where the new cathedral would be built.
I wouldn't dream of telling my kiddies such Miltons. The church realised the potential of a fresh start on a fresh site. It understood that its spiritual power and temporal authority would be represented by what it built. Think big. The cathedral is 449 feet long and the nave 85 feet high. It was built using 75,000 tons of stone, ideal for good acoustics.
When I play the organ here, I have this sense that I'm part of a bigger tradition. Worship has gone on here for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the organ is still the best instrument, I believe, for leading worship. And it is my privilege to be able to play it every single day. I spent many years in cold churches in the north of England practicing, but now I can practice on this at any time. What it does, it gives me a multitude of different sounds. It gives me sounds from the highest, like this, to the lowest, which sound like this. With everything in between. Now just listen to the beginning of this Vidor Toccata. Imagine this at the end of a French cathedral service or at the end of your wedding or something. It's absolutely superb, but you mustn't play it too fast or else it becomes horribly unstuck. So here goes, listen to this. You've got to try and keep it rhythmic. And the real excitement is waiting for the pedals. Steady. Here come the pedals. Isn't that superb? It's all to do with fulfillment of expectation.
Can holiness be measured in units of breadth and height and volume? Quite possibly. But a cathedral is more than a representation of ecclesiastical might. It is the church, just as the Eucharist is to a communicant Christian, the body and blood of Christ and not a mere symbol. Rites and rafters, faith and stone, ineffable mysteries and delicate tracery coalesce in sacred oneness, apparently.
The sun is out, the The sky is blue, there's not a cloud to spoil the view.
The move to the valley was, in the words of the contemporary chronicler Henri d'Avranches, a move to the freedom of a place of ambrosial sweetness from the oppression of a hill of ill repute. Maybe there's more to it than that.
Oh, you've gone away and it's raining.
The site was not quite the paradise Henri d'Avranches claimed. It was actually a marsh.
Now there's a change round in the field. Insole was in the gully. He's been put into the slips again. And Yardine...
To this day, the field southwest of the cathedral, where I was routinely humiliated at cricket, bears the name Marsh Close.
And beds of bells, and he's caught him! He's caught him in the gully!
It could hardly have been a more inhospitable terrain for a large building.
And England are all out for 223.
It seems likely that the cathedral's very site was determined by its proximity to the rivers, which formed the only effective means of transporting building materials. It is equally probable that certain of the rivers were canalised to facilitate this transport. Nature doesn't do these straight lines. There is no doubt that the much later water meadows, a marvel of primitive hydraulic engineering, were devised not only to provide pasture for the sacred cows, but to minimise the risk of flooding.
Well, I heard the news. That's good to rockin' tonight. Well, I heard the news. That's good to rockin' tonight.
The area around Salisbury is predominantly chalk. Save in its deep bed form, which is called clunch, chalk is an indifferent building material. It erodes, it crumbles. No one would ever have dreamt of building a cathedral out of it.
I want you to bring along my rocking shoes, 'cause tonight I'm going to rock away all the blues. I heard the news.
And flint, the other local material, was seldom used other than decoratively. This is not Norfolk. The reason why so many more ancient churches than ancient houses have survived in areas of friable building materials is that the churches were paramount structures of their age. They had money thrown at them. Thus they were not reliant on immediately local materials. Further, prestige attached to buildings made of distant materials. They boasted of haulage, a luxury enjoyed by God and his agents on earth. The cathedral structural material was quarried at Chilmark, 12 miles west of Salisbury, and the nearest point to the city that oolitic limestone, the most enduring of building stones, occurs. 750 years ago, 12 miles was far away. Chilmark is beside the River Nadder, so named because it curls like a snake. Its confluence with the Avon is 200 metres from the cathedral. The Chilmark stone is structural. The predominant decorative material is Purbeck marble, which actually isn't a marble but a metamorphic crystallised limestone capable of being polished, recommended for interior use only. Purbeck is about 50 miles from Salisbury by sea and river. The proportion of Purbeck marble to Chilmark stone may be tiny, but the cathedral is vast. There's enough Purbeck marble to build an entire parish church. With the exceptions of the tower and the spire, the cathedral is the work of a single campaign of construction lasting roughly half a century. This is what differentiates it from all other medieval European cathedrals, with the exception of Amiens. They were able to build it in one go because the money didn't run out. Salisbury Cathedral was entrepreneurial from the very start. Because of the single campaign, the cathedral is stylistically consistent. It possesses a startling purity. The plan is simple, rectilinear and symmetrical. It is only the additions of the cloisters and chapter house which prevent us seeing this symmetry. The classification of this sort of Gothic as early English is telling. There is a dose of self-conscious nationalism here. This is the first great building founded in the English pathology called common sense, which rejects such counterintuitive wheezes as flying buttresses in favour of thick, fortress-like, load-bearing walls. The builders of Salisbury Cathedral didn't know that what they were making was Gothic. The word wasn't used of buildings till the 17th century. What does Gothic mean? Pointed arches? A sensibility? No, that came later. Was the cathedral style structurally determined? Was it the spatial expression of spiritual necessity? Was it a glimpse of heaven on earth? Hence its divestment of weight and the fated illusion that it soars. Was it an imitation of a forest nave? Does its form follow its liturgical functions? Is the cathedral a physical expression of the church's ritualistic needs? As usual, it was probably a combination of all these factors.
Amen.
The history of the cathedral is the history of different ages' tastes, of different ages' attitudes to the Gothic and the past. In the mid-17th century, Molière, who like Sid James and Tommy Cooper collapsed and died on stage, wrote that Gothic ornaments are hateful monsters from an ignorant age whose barbarism produced them in torrents. Just like that. Up till then, the Gothic revival, that's Gothic with a terminal K, had been romantic, stagey, playful. Its greatest artefact was Fonthill Abbey, west of Salisbury. Architect James Wyatt, who had just supervised the demolition of the cathedral's freestanding bell tower and of 2 chapels which had been added to the main structure. Wyatt earned the sobriquet the Destroyer, but by the aesthetic norms of the day, his were unexceptionable actions. They were in accord with current picturesque thought, which valued sublimity, drama and awe over quaintness and prettiness, and reckoned New Gothic was superior to the medieval gear.
Well, I think Wyatt was a bit of a naughty boy, really. He did take a lot of original stained glass out and demolished a couple of chantry chapels, a bell tower, and painted out the ceiling, so I think he's done quite a lot of damage. But at the time, the cathedrals were all changing, and that was the idea.
Well, it's so sweet and easy to love you.
The conceit of Wyatt and the 18th century picturesque movement was to create buildings and landscapes that resembled pictures. The picturesque also taught us to look at extant landscape as though it was a picture. It invited us to consider architecture as a form of man-made scenery. It appropriated buildings. It treated them as visual phenomena, as outsized sculptures. It was indifferent to their function. It gave them a new purpose, as eye-catchers or follies. This is how John Constable treated the cathedral, and it's how we should treat the cathedral, not as a monument to delusion and collective infirmity, but as an enchantment whose tangible physicality vanquishes its supposed spirituality.
There's been a choir in existence at the cathedral probably for about 1,000 years, when the cathedral used to be up at Old Sarum. And the music is a great part of the liturgy. And I've always said that I feel that music can often express sentiments that mere words can't. For many hundred years now, the statutes have said that we should have 16 boy choristers and 6 men. So that's what we've done until 1991, when my predecessor and the then dean decided that after 1,000 years, it was probably about time that girls should get the same opportunity as the boys.
And 1.
Sadly today, in our very secular society, the old school assembly with a Christian hymn in the morning has gone. But sadly it does mean this great tradition of hymnody, which has gone on for centuries, is getting lost. And so I suppose in our great cathedrals we are one of the last standard bearers of this great skill. That's why we do it. It's a very beautiful building, aesthetically, architecturally, but it's a lovely building to sing in as well. But of course, having so much stone around does help enormously, and I think they would have understood that in these vast spaces, and of course in the very early days, the need for unaccompanied singing, which of course it's perfect for that. I mean, it's a comforting building, it's a lovely building to work in, a very special building, and a totally inspiring building. And every time I come out of my front door, I think I stop for a second and gasp, whilst trying to retain a certain sense of reality.
If the cathedral impresses us today, imagine the reaction it must have prompted in people who lived in accommodation that was barely taller than they were, who shared their rooms with family and animals, whose dwellings provided only the most rudimentary shelter. Imagine their wonder at the sheer scale of the structure. Imagine their wonder at the money that was required to construct the largest building they would see in their life, the largest enclosed space. Where did it come from? England in the 13th century was not a secular state. Religious belief was not an optional extra. It infected our forebears as it infects dumb creationists today. The church was the exclusive source of learning. The clerisy was literate, most of the populace was illiterate. The church oppressed with its weight of knowledge. It was a totalitarian monopoly. It was thus able to exact tithes and taxes from the poor. This tithe barn, which belonged to the nunnery of Shaftesbury, is almost 60 metres long. The brides of Christ could store vast quantities of their bounty in it. And for the wealthy, the church had long devised various means of extortion which allowed great art to be made. Relics were officially sanctioned tat. If every shard of the one true cross on which Christ died at the abattoir of Calvary was glued together, the total of those non-carbon date-tested pieces of gnarled wood would far exceed the greatest cross the world has ever seen. It would dwarf this cathedral. In the 21st century, the cathedral raises money through a variety of means. Magna Carta fridge magnet, yours for £1.99. Gargoyle fridge magnet. Nativities made in the Holy Land. The one thing that all the major religions of the world have in common is an endless appetite for kitsch. The church also depended on gifts. There was, of course, a quid pro quo. Indulgences were a scam that demonstrate the church's commercial acumen and compromised greed. It sold its forgiveness. It eased the route to a better afterlife for those who could afford it and who could then exhibit their piety in monuments. Church peddled and still peddles pernicious superstitions. But they're the pernicious superstitions which made Western civilization. The church's product was unique. The promise of heaven was desperately coveted. The superstitious will do whatever they can to appease God and God's gatekeepers. The fear of hell was real. The church left you in no doubt of the consequences of non-adherence to its dogma. Today, we are obliged to dissociate building from archaic purpose. We have to divest the architecture of its original meaning. We have to realise, as we do when faced with temples built by slaves, that beauty can be born of ethical squalor, oppression and corruption. We have to realise that great art is made in the basest causes, to satisfy the whims of murderous popes, insane kings and genocidal tyrants. No doubt this has something to do with God and his mysterious ways.
This building is about the presence of God in the world now, and therefore nobody should come here unless they're prepared to encounter God as well as the history and architecture.
So, should one be ashamed to separate the aesthetic from the moral? This is the most austere of cathedral interiors. Magnificent, certainly, magnificently pure, but equally it is joyless, thin-lipped, too holy by half. It was, of course, built as a Catholic church, but it seems to predict Protestantism, even Puritanism. If it is the house of God, it is the house of a terrifying God, who oppresses with the height and might of his domain, a sort of celestial size queen. It's surely a miracle that it's still standing. It shouldn't be. Its survival defies tectonic reason. The foundations are a mere 4 feet deep, but had they been any deeper, they'd have struck the water table. Yet the only readily visible sign of this deficiency is this, the sleeper wall, which spreads the load of the column. Humankind can't take too much purity. The cathedral's unity is mercifully relieved by additions made down the centuries, most of them stylistically incompatible with the structure and made in the fashion of their own day. The richer and more powerful the dead, the richer and more ostentatious their monument. Chantry chapels are posthumous indulgences made fiscal. They're piously and greedily devoted to prayers for an individual soul.
Audley is buried here, and in his day it would have been extremely colourful and decorated. The niches would have been full of statues. The colour, which is above us, that was all taken off at the Reformation. So the original purpose of the Chantry Chapel was destroyed at the Reformation when purgatory itself was abolished. So our little Chantry Chapel is now without its original purpose.
Sir Thomas Gorges built Longford Castle just outside Salisbury in the last decade of the 16th century. Like his great house, whose triangular plan alludes to the Trinity, his monument is odd, and it is thought to betray his interest in the occult and in astrology. Now, these fashionable pursuits were not sanctioned by the Reformed Church, but Sir Thomas was a rich man, and so was granted in death a dispensation.
Now, of course, this is one of the great attractions for me coming to this cathedral week by week by week. Every time you come in, you see something different, and you get this tremendous sense of this glorious building which has been here for 800 years, virtually the same as it was, and I think it's one of the greatest buildings in the world. There's always the feeling that there is a presence, not in a sort of sinister or ghostly sense, but there's a feel to this cathedral which tends to embrace you when you come to it.
Although the cloisters were begun soon after the body of the cathedral was finished, they feel as though they belong not only to a different age, but to a different, more decorative sensibility. This may have been by design. Salisbury was not a monastic cathedral. The cloisters served no sacred purpose, which is, of course, why they're so attractive. They were rather for contemplation, for the clerics' worldly recreations in their various forms. Many's the nun who was tucked on these stones. The cloisters link the cathedral to the chapter house, which again possesses a sumptuousness and sweetness not found in the cathedral itself. Doubtless this is because it was for the use of the higher clergy who were deserving of a luxury denied to their flock. The spire was added about half a century after the rest of the cathedral was completed. It is 403 feet and 9 inches high, a figure which has fascinated everyone who's ever heard it, with the exception of Mae West. The actress said to the bishop that he could keep his 403 feet.
Here we are at the base of the cathedral spire. And look at this timber here. About 85% of this is the original timber from which was put up at the same time that the spire was built. Now, it wasn't put up here in order to hold the spire up. It was put up as the scaffolding from which the spire was built. And over here, we have got the windlass that was the original medieval crane from which they were able to bring the stone up to this height. And let's look at this wonderful wheel here. Here's something that's entirely functional, and yet look at the quality of these pieces that you've got here as the spars. Outside you've got these handholds, and what would have happened is that two guys would have been here pulling round this side and two guys on the other side there. It's not, as some of the stonemasons used to do, run round inside having little races and so forth. That wasn't the intention. What you find is a lot of people don't actually make it to this height. They just get overcome by the sense of height and so on. But if you do get here, you get a little badge which says you have made the heights of Salisbury Cathedral.
When the cathedral was a building for the credulous rather than for tourists, the congregation would have been denied access to the interior of the tower and the spire. Salisbury is at once quintessentially English and entirely atypical. Its form is at odds with its size. It's like a parish church inflated to bursting point. Remember the Morris Oxford, which was a pumped-up Morris Minor? The architectural styles make no concession to the volume of their deployment. It's a distended model which succeeds through its maximalist scale. The cathedral is evidently the star turn, but it's part of an ensemble. Its close is the largest in England, and it is literally a close, a walled, enclosed space within a city. It is, if you like, a gated suburb.
The Whitsun fairs used to be held in the wonderful close we've got below us there, and people apparently got liquored up and decided to climb the spire. The contemporary accounts suggest that there were 8 or 10 of them going up at the time on the outside of this building, and one of their joyous practices was to discharge urine upon the folk below. They talk about yob culture nowadays.
There are 4 gates which are locked at night. The walls are partly composed of stones plundered from the former cathedral at Old Sarum. It is also a peerless anthology of domestic architecture. This is called Wren Hall. It's not by Christopher Wren. And there's no proof that the College of Matrons is by Wren either, even though it resembles Morden College on Blackheath, which is also alleged to be by him. What we can be sure of is that Wren advised his close friend and fellow astronomer Bishop Seth Ward on how to strengthen the spire. A second thing we can be sure of is that this being genteel provincial England, false attributions to Wren are only to be expected. The King's House Museum holds part of the archaeological collection made by General Augustus Pitt Rivers, a man so fervently anti-clerical that he built a wonderfully eccentric park called the Llama Tree Gardens on his estate 15 miles from here, and he used to send carriages on Sundays to transport the populace in order to keep them out of church. The North Canonry is among the oldest buildings in the Close. Yet what we see today is not medieval, it's not Tudor, it's not of the Restoration. It is predominantly Victorian. And it stares out towards the predominantly Victorian west front of the cathedral. It's the work of the same architect, George Gilbert Scott. Because it's a commercial enterprise, the cathedral authorities are loath to acknowledge that it is anything other than medieval. Old is good box office, Victorian isn't.
On the West Front, you'll find that when the Victorians had their restoration, they actually changed the iconology of the West Front. Also, the style of the statues was completely different. The medieval people would carve from life, from the face of somebody that was there, whereas the Victorians loved to glamorise their saints and martyrs and make all the women elfin face and all the men, macho men. The style has changed, and now when a new statue is carved, it's carved more or less in the style of the medieval works.
Scott's restoration of the 1860s left Salisbury with a choir that is characteristically more medieval than the real thing. It's engagingly reminiscent of St Pancras Station.
If you flew over the top of the cathedral and looked down on its basic cruciform shape, and then you went through the roof, and of course you'd arrive at the choir in the centre of this crucifix, and really, in terms of the liturgy of the place, the choir area is where all the action takes place. It is the heartbeat of the place.
Heartbeat, why do you miss when my baby kisses me?
The Holy Duster started because I happened to be on the Cathedral Council at the time of Sidney Evans, and I noticed that the choir here looking very uncared for. And I said this to the Dean, and he immediately said to me, what are you going to do about it? So that was me hoisted my own petard. And actually, it does look a lot different from how it was before we started, because it really glows now. We're now 20 years old, although a lot of us are much older than that. And so we hope we shall go on forever, really.
I think everybody feels happy when they come in, and they all feel that this is a different place from an ordinary home. You know, sort of, it has a spiritual feeling as soon as you walk in. You can feel it, which is lovely.
She's one of my favourites because she plays the clarinet, and my daughter plays the clarinet. And she's very, very beautiful, and she's concentrating on what she's doing, which a musician ought. Heartbeat. We can't get at the top bits, of course, the very top bits. We once had a cleaner who was very athletic and used to get up there and frighten us to death going up there, but we can't. I can just reach with my tickle stick up underneath and do the carved work, but no, I think they're lovely. And we often say we dust more in here than we do on our own houses. But it's good. We love it.
I think it's because it's our cathedral, and you do get quite possessive about it, actually. And I love the sort of through vision right through without the choir arch. It's lovely. You can stand at the back and see right the way through.
George Gilbert Scott's reredos, which divided the choir from the nave, was removed in the early 1960s, when Victorian taste was still commonly abhorred. Nonetheless, the cathedral still retains much fine Victorian work, and to me it will always feel Victorian, the house of a censorious, irate, unloving God who takes cold showers and never spares the rod.
Scott was very sympathetic. There's examples of where he's he's been sympathetic to replacement, and he's always left a clue as to what was there originally. So I know people have said a lot of bad things about Scott, but I think, all in all, he was very sympathetic towards restoration.
The cathedral is a work in perpetual progress. It's a replica of Salisbury Cathedral, an on-site forgery of the original. It is forever mutating. It's eternally being renewed.
Every day I still marvel at it every time I come here. The sheer size of it and the amount of hours that have gone into it to create it. It's fantastic. Even if we were to recreate a small part of it, it would be a major operation. Costing millions of pounds, I expect. Well, all this stone is old, isn't it? When it comes from the quarry, it's probably just as old as the stone that's here. It's just that it's been done recently.
Its very fabric depends on this stone yard and the skill of the surveyors, masons and carvers here. Their work is delicately balanced. There are countless degrees of preservation, protection, restoration. What intervention should be made?
Every stone which is marked up in colour is being replaced. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of stones for replacement, but as a whole area, you know, it's very minimal compared with the whole volume of stone which is actually in that section.
In fact, the architects are very loath to replace any stone which can be kept if at all possible. That's why quite a few of the stones on the just pieced in and repaired by the Conservation Department. It's something we don't always like to do ourselves. We like to see new stone fitted more often.
Everyone wants to conserve everything, and I think perhaps we've gone a bit conservation mad. Certainly in the masonry department, we would certainly like to do more new work, and sometimes we feel that our hands are a little bit... don't get to do enough new carving and new work as perhaps we would like. But then left to our own devices, we'd probably knock down a great deal of the cathedral and rebuild it. Perhaps not that bad, but still, I think we would like to replace more than we do.
As you can see, that these bits here are all new bits. They were obviously beyond any kind of conservation and restoration. They were quite badly done, so they've actually been replaced. As we've come down a little bit further here, some of this stone is still pretty solid. I mean, that's the original medieval stone. So what we've done here is we've actually repaired the stone in a lime-based mortar to try and imitate the stone around it so that it fits in.
There seems currently to be an intention to sweep away the accretion of the ages in order to safeguard the stone. But this process of replacement and purging of dirt and lichen is liable to result in a brand new medieval cathedral.
Sometimes people feel that just because a stone is old, it's somehow sacrosanct, but it isn't. You know, once it's old, once it's dead, it's less than useless, and you might as well chuck it away and put a lovely new healthy piece of stone in. Because ultimately it's diseased flesh. Get rid of it and let the building live. That's the thing.
You can't help but think of an ancient starlet with a facelift. This is what the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings was founded to prevent. Decay in buildings is as inevitable as mortality in humans. It's the way of the world.
By today's standards, our work's much, much better than the medieval work by far. You could, you'd say that it was rubbish, really, if they put up standard of work like medieval day today.
The ruinous and the derelict are preferable to the repaired and the perfect. Turner realised this. But again, dereliction is not good box office. And a cathedral is nothing if not a business. Sure, it's also a place of worship. It's also the focal point of a community. But these are now peripheral roles.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Good afternoon. How are you?
All right, thank you. Where are you from?
This was the first English cathedral to have invited its visitors to pay entry fees.
There's some kind of a donation we have to make to...
You don't have to, sir, but we suggest... I don't know what it's like in Finland, but we get no state aid here, and to keep our buildings up, we ask people to put money through a donations box. There are boxes inside, but if you give it to me, then I give you a little docket that says thank you very much. And that's only a suggestion. You don't have to obey it. You know, invitations can be turned down. But when people come up to me and they say, what do you want? I usually say, whatever you like to give me. You know, so it's you literally whatever you feel able to.
Okay, this is just what you suggest.
Okay. Yes, yeah.
Well, let's say they keep the change and take £8.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Right. But we've actually packed up because we stopped taking donations at 4:45. So after all that, I can't give you any change because it's all locked up in the safe. You see, right? And there are donation boxes inside.
I think over the centuries, the roles of these great cathedrals have changed, and certainly today we're dealing with a lot of different demands, a lot of different expectations from people. On one level, of course, this is a marvellous tourist attraction. People come here to see this fantastic building, and we now have this marvellous new restaurant, which means our Ministry of Hospitality can be developed further. You know, that's a very symbolic thing in the early days. You know, what did Jesus do? I mean, he ate and drank with his disciples, and that's always been a very important Christian ethic.
Salisbury Cathedral, open daily. The refectory restaurant, available in the evenings for a variety of events, such as meetings, dinners and presentations. The chapter house lawn, a great location for a marquee to accommodate wedding receptions and larger functions. The chapter house, available in the evenings for drinks receptions, intimate concerts and small dinner parties. For more information, contact us by phone or fax or email salisbury.cathedral@compass-group.co.uk. There have always been merchants in the temple. So why should the temple not kick out the middleman and become a merchant itself? The Church of England's role today is to care for a priceless collection of masterpieces, and that requires income. So, build a roller coaster, and these columns might have been made for pole dancing.
A very new dimension of cathedral's life is the casual visitor, the short-term visitor. Over the generations, people will have come on pilgrimage here, but they'd have been few in number. And they may have only come once in their life. It may have been the great pilgrimage of their life. Now we find that we have thousands of people every day. We have massive numbers of worshippers and tourists. We have to give them a flavour of all the things that have stood us in good stead for 700 years.
Have mercy upon you, pardon and deliver you from all your sins. Amen.
Cathedrals are popular, it seems to me, because they articulate very well and with sometimes superb music and the best of creative performance, that they articulate actually what the heart of the human spirit is searching for.
accept these prayers for the sake of your Son, our Saviour, Jesus Christ. Amen.
The building itself is sacred. It's a holy place. And if people go away only having encountered the refectory, the restaurant and the toilets and the shop and haven't been touched by something of the awesome presence of God, then we have failed.
When we look at this marvellous building, we're forced to reflect that God does indeed exist. It's a recurring and banal human invention. And when we celebrate him and his many mansions, what we are in fact celebrating is the human appetite for creation. And we may hate ourselves for the buildings that we love. We can't do anything about it, because they choose us. We don't choose them.
I really mean it's not enough to love me on this earth below. It's not enough to take me everywhere you go. I want to know, will you love me in heaven?
And if medieval buildings float your boat, you can catch Restoration Nation in Scotland tomorrow at 8:05 on BBC 4, and Cathedral on Monday night at 7 on BBC 2 shows the dramatised reconstruction of Lincoln Cathedral after the original was destroyed in 1185.